Blog Talk Radio.
Good evening. Welcome to The View Up Here. I am your host, Canadian Glenn, and it is June 27th, 2018. Tonight, Canada is generous, isn't it? The numbers say not so much. Canada enjoys a reputation at home and abroad as a generous nation. The legendary acceptance and support of the red maple leaf around the world was built over decades, with the general performance from governments to match the image. Everybody who's traveled has heard it. We've seen it in press from around the world. Those Canadians are fair and understanding people. They're willing to help. That's our reputation. But how long has this reputation been riding on history rather than recent actions? Globally, according to recent studies, it seems Canada is not pulling its weight at home or abroad, despite being told how the economy is leading the G7, how well we survived the 2008 crash compared to others, how our history will not allow us to forget those less fortunate. Social spending has been on a steady decline in Canada since the 1990s. With a rapidly aging population, a near zero net birth rate, and immigration being used to decrease the average age of the workforce, seems logical and prudent that you have to put steps in place with social programs to enable and support 21st century Canada. Because we've got a pretty good idea of what that's going to look like, and we're not keeping pace. Neoliberalism has established itself as the way forward, but statistical evidence says otherwise. Productivity, physical and mental health, and educational opportunities are all part of the same picture. That takes a steady and constant hand to improve a nation's overall health, not a hand that offloads, downsizes, and cuts funding for more than a generation. Now, Canadians have heard talk about things like Pharmacare, childcare, universal dental care, guaranteed income, but other nations have moved past the talk into delivery with positive results. And why the disparity within Canada itself? Why do politics become the method of discourse instead of evidence, statistics, and a solution? Why has inequality increased in scope and pace and continues to do so? What cost will Canada pay in the future for the neoliberal decisions of today and recent yesterdays? Well, tonight we welcome back Greg Fingus, a lawyer, blogger, freelance political commentator from a progressive humanist viewpoint, to talk about Canada's social program outlook. Good evening, Greg. Welcome back to The View Up Here.
Good evening, Glenn. Thanks once again for inviting me.
My pleasure, sir. There's been some international reports out lately that are kind of opening some eyes, shall we say. I mean, stuff from the OECD, stuff from the American Medical Association, stuff from the Canadian Medical Association. I know recently in the Regina Leader Post, I believe at the end of March, you kind of looked at this information and gave a little bit of an overall view about it. Now, is that a good place to start for what we want to address here tonight, your column?
I think so, although I'll take a step back, and I think you've described the positive way we see ourselves. To me, probably the most interesting statement of our perception is from someone who was highly critical of it and, in fact, did his utmost with a great deal of power to try to change it. Going back, of course, to Stephen Harper's complaint about Canada, he was speaking to a U.S. right-wing group describing it in his words as a Northern European welfare state in the worst sense of the term and very proud of it. So as with any other Stephen Harper phrase, you can essentially hear the contempt dripping off of it. That's, of course, from the perspective of one who was so anti-government as to publicly claim that no tax is a good tax. But there's certainly a kernel of truth in there that we pride ourselves on being a comparatively generous country, particularly in contrast to the U.S. in healthcare and immigration, peacekeeping, and foreign aid. I guess the issue that comes up is whether that was even an accurate statement at the time and how much less accurate is it today based on an actual look at the numbers. And when you look at what the OECD has said, for example, the numbers show that we were really never ahead of the average in the industrialized world in terms of our social spending, how much we've done for the people who need it most. And since that time, and only in part due to Harper himself, we've been falling further and further behind.
No, I think that is. I'm sorry. I just wanted to step in for a minute and say, I think that's something that everybody has to understand. There's no doubt that what the Harper government did was not a help, but people have to remember Paul Martin, Jean Chrétien, before him, Mulroney. This has been going on for a long time. But please carry on.
That's right. And in fact, the OECD helpfully has its data available going back to 1980. And what that shows is that initially Canada, or about 15 years after that point, was fairly close to the OECD average in social spending. It once exceeded that average in 1990, and our total social spending, as the OECD defines it, never got above 18.4%, and that was in 1995. So after that, it dropped precipitously. The biggest drop we ever saw, in fact, was during that Paul Martin as finance minister period, 1995 to 2000. It dropped to 15.8% and has been hovering between 16 and 17% ever since. Now, what's interesting in this international comparison is that other countries have in fact ranked lower than Canada at times, but passed us since. So we see, for example, the absolute mess of a political situation in the States and think to ourselves, well, at least we're not doing as badly as they are. In fact, they used to be behind us on social spending. They're now ahead. The same goes for the UK and Australia, other countries where we think they're part of the English-speaking world. They have, at worst, similar political influences, maybe even veer further to the right at times. They, too, are actually making more progress than we are in terms of putting together the social safety net to keep people going from day to day. So we've never really lived up to our own self-image, and we're falling further behind as the rest of the world moves forward.
Is this something that you think is, the perception that's different from the reality? Do you think this is something that's just cultural to Canadians, or do you think there's been any active effort to keep it going or to push it by the governments as they were making these cuts over time?
Well, I suspect there are two pieces to it. One of them is the actions of governments who certainly see it in their interest to tell us, oh, we're doing everything we possibly can. We don't have another dollar we could possibly put into supporting people. Since if people believe that, it's a great excuse to, in fact, not support people, and then you can take your public money and divert it to whatever other purpose you want. In terms of public awareness, my sense is that the problem is simply that people don't understand how we compare to the rest of the world. And we have the elephant next door. Much of our political coverage from outside our borders comes from a country which, at least in its public presentation, hardly ever talks about social issues in a positive way. So the perception is certainly that however much we're backsliding, again, at least we're not doing quite as badly as our neighbor, who we see as our main international influence. But when you actually compare us to the Scandinavian, the European countries who we like to classify ourselves with, we're far, far behind them. In fact, we're well below even the OECD average, but on some of the data, we're less than half of the social spending of Denmark, for example, barely half of France or Sweden or Finland or all the countries that we like to consider our international peers as soft, smart powers and generally generous countries.
But yet, that's not the reality. When you look at the studies, do you think this is just one of the things that every successive federal government has just figured? Well, if nobody brings it up about this pattern, then we're not either. We're just going to let Canadians keep thinking that we're the proud standard bearers of the days of Lester Pearson. Is every government just content to let it ride here at home?
That's certainly been my perception for any of them since probably the minority governments of the early 70s. That certainly Liberals took power in the 90s, promising everything to everyone. Their first priority was cutting budgets and cutting deficits. Their second priority was cutting taxes. And then at the end of their term in office, they finally decided, oh, hey, just give us 3 more terms and we might get around to the social programs. And by that point, it was far too late in the day for anyone to put up with them in power any longer. And then Stephen Harper got into power. And the interesting part here is that no one ever wins power promising to take this attitude towards 5 points when they took power was the idea of improving healthcare, reducing wait times, putting more money into some aspects of our social programs. But once they get there, of course, their motivations and their intentions are somewhat different. They might implement that one point, but at every opportunity, they cut or they limit increases to below actual costs and leave the social safety net worse off than they found it. So it's a gap to me between what people both believe is happening and I think what people actually want and what's actually being done by the governments who hold power.
Isn't this another issue? Did something happen to your sound horse? I'm hearing myself echo.
I'm here. Nothing's changed on this end.
Okay, well, I can hear myself on a delay. That's new.
Okay.
But we'll go along. Isn't that something that has also come under question lately? What exactly is it that people expect from their social services system? And is it being delivered, or is it being presented as being delivered? Is there a problem with the questions government is asking the population, or is it what they're delivering?
I think very much so, and part of the rhetorical effort for several decades now has been to try to limit our expectations, to say that to think everyone has a right to housing or to food or to water or to a basic income, the basics of life, is just far more than could possibly be delivered, and that therefore it's somehow responsible or even compassionate to try to cut people off of benefits, limit our ambition in what we do provide, and direct our focus toward a perpetually expanding economy which is going to fund social services one of these decades but just never seems to get there. So when people are asked whether they want to see expanded social programs, the answer tends to be yes. But there isn't much of an organized effort to actually put them forward and make sure that what people want is transformed into policy. There's been a bit better effort around Pharmacare in the last couple of years. But aside from that, there's, I think, a lot of latent demand that's being fed by the occasional campaign promise, but by very few serious efforts to actually convert demand into policy.
Well, when I looked at this subject, I kind of saw three vectors to this system. Of course, we have the legacy program, like the Canada Pension Plan, Old Age Security, which have been funded quite comfortably for a long time. As the population ages, I'm sure we're going to see demand on that program we've never seen before. Then I see more immediate social support, whether it be through income assistance or free health care, etc. And the third vector I see is looking to the future. And the OECD report paid a fair amount to the condition of going forward. Canada didn't fare so well in that. So I see us kind of falling behind on all three vectors. But I can understand why the statistics are what they are. But is there any way to address them one at a time, or is it a system?
Well, I think part of the issue is a need to address the different vectors in different ways. And certainly once a social benefit is in place, it tends to be very difficult for a government to suddenly undercut the people who have come to reasonably expect and rely on it. And that's why when it comes to attacking our existing social programs, particularly health or education, at most you tend to see them nibble around the edges, try to privatize what they can or dump off to other jurisdictions what they can. But for the most part, it's pretty well recognized that the overall system is going to be there for quite some time to come. So the fight in those areas, which are the ones most visible and most often experienced by people, tends to be around making sure that there isn't some Trojan horse being introduced into the system that will create a counterweight powerful enough to overcome the public awareness and popularity of the existing programs. Now, when you're looking at kind of smaller social supports, the problem there is the comparative lack of awareness or broad public support for them. And that makes it a lot easier for a government to say that well, if we get rid of this, people won't notice. And there are times when they miscalculate. Certainly in Saskatchewan's budget last year, for example, we managed to shed Brad Wall as premier because his government severely miscalculated on how much people were willing to put up with. So again, there's that latent interest in preserving what we have, even if it's not something that we're relying on right at the moment. But unless we really see it being attacked systematically, the public inclination hasn't been to rise up and actually take the steps to push governments to keep those in place.
Okay, I am getting reports.
I am getting reports from listeners
that something changed with our connection.
Something changed with our connection.
So I'm just going to try.
Okay, I will
try something here.
Okay, am I still echoing? No.
Unmuted.
Okay, am I echoing now?
Okay, am I echoing now?
Yes.
Yes.
Greg, could I ask you to hang up and call back the same way you did?
I can try one thing first, and we'll see if this works. So just a moment.
Okay.
Is this better?
Check.
Can you hear me?
Yes. And I'm not hearing you echo. All right, we're fixed.
That's good.
Okay. Now, yes, I understand what. I don't know. About 5 minutes ago, when you were talking, all of a sudden your speech got scrambled for a couple seconds, and then it changed after that. So, but hey, we fixed it.
That's weird. So the change I made here was plugging in headphones to get rid of the echo. But yeah, I'm not sure why it wasn't a problem beforehand. Anyway, It's working now. So I guess to the third point then, as to the future, the big issue there is that in the same way that the programs we have now, I think, are very well insulated from too much intrusion based on the public being aware of them and supportive of them. Essentially, we don't know what we're missing in terms of the programs we don't have. And in any particularly important area, such as Pharmacare, there are a lot of current profits that stand to be lost if we have a more comprehensive and more compassionate system to make sure people have what they need. And so any efforts to improve the system runs into the problem of a relatively unmotivated public compared to some highly motivated corporate actors pushing any avenue they have to keep things as they are.
This brings up another question that I was going to bring up at some point tonight. We don't know what we're missing or we don't feel the decline in the service if the service has never been there to begin with. Do you think that's why we see this propensity, especially during campaigns, that we get these ideas floated of new universal social programs? And studies are shown where it can be financed, it can be viable, it's done here, it's done there. But yet, when election is over and government is sworn in, these things all seem to disappear. Do you think what you mentioned there is a factor, that since we've never had it, we wouldn't know what to expect?
That's certainly a problem in terms of the public's willingness to push a government. I think another huge problem is the perception of politics as being simply a matter of consumer choice. You cast your ballot, you ignore things for 4 years, and expect the people you elected to do what they promised to do while they were asking for your vote. When the reality of governance is, of course, very different from that, and if there aren't a lot of people pressuring a government to keep its promises, there will be a tendency to drift or to pick and choose priorities based on who is in fact being loudest and most forceful in insisting that their interests be met, whether they reflect campaign promises or not. And again, not only do we not know what we're missing, but the individual benefit of any particular program is never obvious until you're in the situation of being without the pharmacare or the dental care, that sort of thing that you need. And the number of people lacking that at any given time isn't necessarily enough to move the needle.
So just the general state of smoke in the air seems to work the best for governments. It's the safest route for them to take. As long as there's nothing, real definite one way or another, we've got other things that we can push and get through.
That's right. Get elected promising the moon and then govern with your head firmly in the sand. And as long as no one rouses you, you figure you're safe.
Interesting and typical, I must say. But there's something else that related to the numbers that the OECD brought up. We've been hearing lately in the Ontario provincial campaign about hallway medicine. We heard about this issue not that long ago nationally from the Maritimes, from New Brunswick. We've heard about it in British Columbia. It's happened everywhere from time to time. And governments say, well, we can't spend any more without the dreaded quote-unquote tax increases. But something the OECD study found out is we're getting what we pay for. The problem is not really delivery or cost. The problem is we're getting what we pay for. So how can political parties or governments say that the solution to eliminate hospital wait times, surgical waiting lists, etc., isn't it obvious that the only solution is more funding?
I would think it's obvious that that's at least part of the solution. And what the OECD data also tells us is that there is fiscal capacity there that we're simply not using. And the idea that somehow it's possible for the average OECD country to spend well over a fifth of their GDP on social spending, and we're 4 points below that, doesn't make any sense. These are our international peers, and we should be asking why we aren't at the very least on par, if not in fact trying to get ahead of the international average as to what we're putting into our people.
No, it just seems it seems to be a lot of contradictions in this whole picture of what Canadians think we have, what successive governments tell Canadians we have, and the reality of what we have. I mean, I understand the inertia. Because, like you said, every government, once they achieve power, they have their agenda. And, hey, the guys before us for 20 years ignored this stuff. I guess that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
So what, I really see the point, like you mentioned, that it does take pressure. It doesn't matter if you have a minority government coalition or whether you have a majority. It does take pressure from the citizens to force any change. We've seen that who knows how many times. We probably will never stop. But something else I wanted to bring up, considering the OECD report, as far as the next generation, the younger people, the future workforce of Canada, who will be paying into legacy programs, and like any reasonable person, if they're paying their taxes into social programs, I believe their expectation that when the time comes or the need arises, those programs will be there for them as well. And one demographic they looked at has an acronym of NEET, N-E-E-T, and that means not employed or enrolled in education or taking training. So that's the NEET share. And what the OECD data shows that Canada's around the average for the population that is not employed in education or training for 15 to 29-year-olds. But Canada's NEET average is 2 percentage points higher than before the crash of 2008. How does this happen?
Well, I wonder if a substantial part of the issue is the perpetually rising cost of the education and training component of that. And while I would certainly like to be able to concur in thinking that younger people will rightly expect that they'll benefit from the same programs that they're paying into now, I do worry that there's enough generational inequity at this point that they may simply get fed up with the whole concept of social programs based on the perception that policy has simply been shaped to favor other generations at their expense. That right now education is so much more expensive than it has been. Student debt is so much higher than it's ever been. The cost of housing is so much higher than it's ever been, based on policies that are intended to keep taxes low and property values high for people who are already through the toughest economic times of their lives. And that eventually another generation is going to come along. I hope that the response will be to want the same benefits and protections that previous generations enjoyed. I worry that the response will be to atomize, to say, you've told me so many times I'm only in it for myself, that let's have policy reflect that, and we'll all be worse off for a dog-eat-dog mentality.
Do you think that is part of the cultural perspective that has changed from one generation to the next? I mean, you speak about the boomers and the Gen X people, a lot more unionization, a lot more stable jobs, a lot more manufacturing. And then when we get into the 80s and move beyond, we get more of that quote-unquote entrepreneur attitude of everything. And everybody's an army of one. Do you think in the long run that may enable governments of the day to simply eliminate social programs?
I certainly think it's a possibility, and right now there seem to be signs pointing in a few different directions. There are certainly some hopeful signs in terms of younger politicians succeeding, or politicians appealing to younger people for votes, succeeding by making the point that they can in fact expect more than they're told is true by the politicians who hold power right now. But I certainly do worry that there are fewer points of collective action right now, especially, and that as much as people might see the appeal of social programs on an individual basis, that if we don't have the focus we need for that desire to be brought together and to impact on the broader political system, the people will either drift away or simply just look to benefit themselves in a system where they figure that it's been set up to make sure that everybody can't get ahead.
Governance by frustration and apathy is not generally perceived as a good thing for social programs, then, is what you're saying.
Absolutely. And an obvious enough point, I know, but unfortunately, as obvious as it seems, it does seem to have been one of the defining factors of our politics for far too long.
Well, yeah, I think, again, we can compare that to the elephant you mentioned. Culturally, we are so looking to the south. I don't think that can ever change to a certain extent. I think it increases with every generation, but then so does the cultural penetration from the United States in every generation, as it does around the world. But the one thing I wanted to bring up was the research done and published in the Journal of the American Medical Association. The point of their research was to compare the U.S. to other countries in healthcare spending. And it did that, but it also gave other countries a chance to see data sets that maybe their own governments weren't too keen on collecting. And we were able to see that. And I mean, it was the U.S. against 10 other nations, Western, liberal democracies, industrialized. Canada was 7th out of 11 for health spending as a share of gross domestic product. And in the social programs, we were dead last in 11. Has this, what's the right word I'm looking for? Has this fetish for tax cuts been the main reason that we see numbers like this?
that's certainly my impression, and certainly the most striking piece of that to me is the fact that as proud as we are of a system where we're able to cover everyone for health care for less public money than the U.S. spends, to say nothing of the mess of a private system they have on top of it, the flip side to that is that even the U.S. spends more public money on health care than we do. So, again, the fiscal capacity is there. And I don't know of many people who would want to make the choice to spend less than we can when there's room to do more to keep people healthy. Yet, obviously, that's what's happening at the moment.
No, I mean, I'm also looking at a column that was in the Globe and Mail on March 20th by Andre Picard, who's a great health scene writer. And he said that the AMA research set out to answer the question, why is healthcare spending in the U.S. so much greater than the other high-income countries? Well, what he came down to was the quote from the health economist Uwe Reinhardt, who said, it's the prices, stupid. So basically, you know, isn't that what we would expect because of the quote-unquote free market and the lack of government price controls? People will charge whatever they can. Yeah, that's the big numbers overall. But yet, despite all that money paid just for profit, just for stockholder earnings, as you said, the United States government still pays a higher percentage into their healthcare system for all its things wrong with it than Canada does. And we're supposed to have such a tight, efficient system. This isn't a matter.
And to me,
I was just going to say, this isn't a matter of the catchword efficiencies and delivery. This is just being cheap, is it not?
Well, to my mind, there are two crucial factors that make the U.S. system so inefficient and that we should recognize as existing in parts of our own system as well. I mean, the profit and price gouging is one of them. The other is the giant administrative system set up around denying people coverage. And you saw when the U.S. was talking about Obamacare and trying to expand the availability of health insurance at the very least, they were walking on eggshells to avoid affecting the large number of jobs that currently exists to manage care and reduce people's access to care through the insurance systems that want to limit what they end up paying for. So those are obvious areas where an awful lot of money gets spent in the U.S. Not to actually improve care or even provide care, but tangentially to the healthcare system to reduce the availability of the care people need. And we do have aspects of that in our system, particularly on the Pharmacare side, where there is a substantial private insurance industry which makes its money by determining what to fund, what not to fund, which has a fair bit of resources dedicated to that same type of task. And we have fairly high prescription drug prices, which haven't yet been even bargained down to the extent they could be under our current structures, and certainly aren't controlled the way they could be if we took a serious look at prioritizing the availability of needed medicine over the intellectual property interests of pharmaceutical corporations.
And these issues, of course, will be a factor going forward in any new NAFTA talks or other agreements like CPTPP, will they not?
Absolutely, and part of the irony of the Trump administration's actions is that we had already given far more than we should have within the TPP structure, and for the moment at least, that's on hold pending the U.S. jumping back into the picture. Now, unfortunately, the deal we have signed on to with the balance of the TPP group of countries essentially says that it's simply a deferral, and that if the U.S. comes back in, every single IP demand that they made suddenly gets put back into effect. So at any moment, we could have those harmful provisions come into effect without our having any further say in it.
Do you think this is one of the looming specters behind the curtain for a complete walk back on anything related to Pharmacare by any federal party? Maybe.
In theory, I don't think it's necessarily connected, in that no matter how bad your IP system is, you're still somewhat better off with a Pharmacare system. Maybe the benefits are reduced, but at least the reduction in administrative expenses or the patchwork of coverage being replaced with national coverage would still be advantages worth pursuing. So I'm not sure that necessarily is the entire problem. I do think that the private insurance industry is almost certainly a factor, that, again, there are profits to be made right now by going after customers who want to pay for Pharmacare since it doesn't otherwise exist, and that if you want to have a national Pharmacare system, you need to be willing to stand up to those interests.
Huh. There's something else. There's a few just bullet points in the American Medical Association research that I just wanted to cover. Canada spends 14% of its health dollars on long-term care, compared to 26% by Sweden. Canada spends the least on inpatient hospital care at 17%, compared to 32% for Holland. Canada also has among the lowest number of hospital beds, 2.7 per 1,000 population, compared to 13.2 per 1,000 in Japan. And Canada has among the very shortest average length of hospital stays. Isn't this directly the result of a generation of offloading and discontinuing programs and tweaking provincial healthcare problems? Well, that's not covered anymore. Isn't that the way we've gotten to this point?
Absolutely. And when you talked earlier about hallway medicine, these are very much linked concepts, in that the reason why we don't have enough rooms is that we have unrealistic expectations as to how long people have to stay in hospital, what facilities we need to have available to account for people's needs. We've underfunded the capital side of things for so long that there's just no room, and so we shuffle people in and out as quickly as we can, even if that's worse for their health and for our public purse in the long run. And when things go wrong, then you have people waiting in the hallway because you don't have the room ready for them. The other interesting piece there is the amount of public funding for long-term care, which is another area where I think we have a lot more done on a for-profit basis as opposed to a publicly funded basis, resulting in worse care and or far more expensive care in an area where, these are generational issues. You can see them coming decades away. If you plan for them, you can get better results out of the public purse. And if you choose not to plan for them, then you end up paying a lot more in the long run.
Well, we've seen that in Alberta with the private extended care. As far as the other things go, me, myself, less than 2 years ago, was booked for day surgery, and I ended up checking myself out on the morning of the third day. The expectations that are put on the system, I think, have changed drastically. I've come across people in the healthcare sector that say, the timelines we're given, we know we can't do. It's because, this is what we do. We know how long things take. And administrators and program directors say, no, it doesn't take that long. It takes 60% of that time. And one other thing from that research is that there are 2.6 physicians per 1,000 population in Canada. That's 9th out of the 11 countries studied. But the problem is not necessarily overall. Canada is third in physicians in urban areas, but 11th in rural and remote areas. What can government do that they're not doing to address this? Are they just fine with the migration to the cities? Because there are votes out there.
Certainly the migration to the cities is the easier way for governments to approach things, to simply say, in the rural areas where we've closed some of our services, coincidentally, now there aren't enough people to sustain more services, so we'll close those as well.
Yeah.
And that's another issue of significant inequality within Canada. It certainly doesn't help in that respect that we have, comparatively speaking, an awful lot of sparsely populated territory compared to a lot of other countries. But at the same time, there are policy choices to be made as to whether you choose to manage that by recognizing the needs of people in rural areas. To my mind, this would be one of the hidden benefits of a guaranteed income, is that you would make it possible for people to live in more rural areas where housing and other goods are available more cheaply in some cases, and then thereby preserve enough of a population base to make services sustainable, rather than saying that we expect you to go out and find a job, and if there's none in your current town because it was based on a past industrial model, then you're going to have to go to the cities because we don't see the value in maintaining a population base around where you are now.
Once again, it sounds like, from experience we see in the Scandinavian countries, in other parts of the European Union, even in some other countries that are not necessarily in the same mold, such as Cuba, Venezuela, they've had a big picture focus on the whole thing, not just how many hospital beds do we have, but they start with how many medical students do we have? What's their financial situation? Are they going to stay here? Do they have the facilities they need to work in? It's a much bigger view. Is that just governments use the excuse in the Western democracies that we don't have the quote-unquote wiggle room to deal with the whole system like that? Or is it just a reluctance because it's a minefield? Is it like don't wake the people up? Is a problem in Canada that most people don't understand where we are today compared to other countries around the world, and we're not in good shape? Is it no news is good news for governments?
I'm not sure, and certainly my experience is that there seems to be a fair bit of planning that happens, whether it's within the systems themselves or through outside observers. The question is, to what extent are the predictable eventualities actually accounted for in government policy, or does the can get kicked down the road in favor of something that plays better for the next election cycle at the expense of long-term decision-making? I don't think we're lacking for systemic awareness of the options available to us. What we're lacking is the long-term view in deciding among the options.
Again, so politics.
All politics.
Well,
but certainly one of the other...
Go ahead.
Well, I think you'd mentioned, among the other studies, one from the Canadian Medical Association Journal. You mentioned having that as one to discuss. And that was an interesting one by Daniel Dutton et al., dealing with both the amount we spend right now on social spending and health spending, and using a different definition than the OECD, but in particular, the effects of spending in one area as opposed to the other. And then we've talked tonight about how there should be room to spend a fair bit more on health than we currently do. But what that study found is that even if your focus is on improving health outcomes, you're better off directing marginal money toward social spending, because that's where there are such urgent needs that if you put in an extra dollar, people's health, along with their other circumstances, will improve more than if you put that dollar into a hospital. So again, there's work being done to assess what needs to be done, what can be improved, where our resources are best deployed. But there's very little political interest in acting on that.
That's a very good point. And again, maybe it's just me, but, I wonder, with the way politics works in the 21st century, that's just too complex to present for their sales program. It seems very frustrating that there's almost a reluctance. I mean, the Right Honorable Kim Campbell, most famous quote ever, I'll paraphrase, but a campaign is no time to talk about issues. So if that's how it is, I know there are groups out there. I mean, there are private, citizen-funded, citizen-driven groups such as Medicare support, public health delivery support. Then you get into the professional associations and you have lobby groups that are not particularly on the same page. They keep their options very narrow as well, do they not? I mean, let's be truthful. You never hear about a pro-public health delivery group talking about tuition for medical school. They're never talking about the lack of public housing that would create a better environment to enable better health to cut the demand on the system. Does there need to be a bit of a circling the wagons to get anything done?
I'm not sure about that, and I will mention that we're in the midst of a very interesting and I think promising time in Saskatchewan provincial politics right now. The new leader of the provincial NDP here is Ryan Miley, who has worked as a practicing physician, essentially decided to get into politics based on the idea that he saw the same problems over and over again in his medical practices that had political roots and political solutions to them, and decided to go into politics on that basis. And watching his travels over a few leadership campaigns and into a think tank, I've seen the Canadian Doctors for Medicare, for example, as an organization that deals primarily with medical issues, but that ties in the social factors that matter as well. I've seen instances of medical associations as well weighing in on the social determinants of health, adopting that as a necessary element of any meaningful planning in your healthcare system. And there has been some spillover even into public policy, most strongly within the people who I think have been connected to Ryan and his associates, but to some extent as well, even in what are perceived as more centrist parties, at least paying lip service to the idea. So I do think there's some recognition of that, going beyond the silos of groups with their particular issues. It certainly hasn't gone far enough and hasn't, I think, reached the public to a great enough extent to make that something people see as a primary way of thinking about politics and society, as opposed to a box to check off on a platform or a set of talking points to say, hey, look, I recognize this. Can we go on to the next point? And we'll see whether it kind of develops the roots it needs to in order to strongly influence policy choices.
Well, we hear over and over again, rightly so, how on a mean average, the working population of Canada is, if not the most educated in the world, it is very, very close to the top. when will that spill down into the public realm, into the social realm? And I don't mean social as in Facebook, I mean social as in society. Do you think we're seeing little baby steps with the leaders as we have a generational change? I mean, you look at somebody like Jagmeet Singh, who is without a doubt a new generation, a new type of Canadian. And not only do we get limited coverage of the leader of the NDP federally, but when we do, he scores highest consistently when he speaks on social issues. And the way he does it is different than in the past. You can tell he's a different generation, the way he says it. Is that an inkling of where our society needs to be looking, listening, if we're going to do okay in the future? Do you think the status quo of, well, we're aware of that issue and we're looking at it, that's not going to cut it anymore? Is there going to come a force that we're going to have to change a lot quicker than that?
I guess my inclination is to try to rely less on individual leaders to make change and more on developing social structures that will, if not bring about change on their own, at least be able to support change when there's a political opportunity to make it. And I guess on that point, when you talk about a distinction between types of social, I'm not sure if that distinction matters anymore. To me, we're a very well-educated populace. We're also an increasingly atomized and isolated populace. And that's where I think we're losing out on the opportunity to interact with people to the extent that would have been done at a time when socializing meant going to a community event and speaking to groups of people, as opposed to going on Facebook and seeing what people are doing over the internet. And that at some point we need to figure out how to use either the tools we have in a way that does more to reinforce social bonds and social pressures and social forces for change, or we need to take a step back and start looking at renewing and revitalizing our physical spaces to interact with people and start working at the ground level in communities, as opposed to hoping for a leader or an ad campaign or a meme to be the source of change.
I agree with that 100%. But again, I just sense this propensity to when in Rome, and don't hate the player, I hate the game. I'm very hesitant to put my faith in any sort of assembly that is going to turn this in the direction we have to go, because we know where this leads. We've seen this already in other countries around the world. I mean, look what happened in a place like Greece, although, it was a lot quicker and for other reasons, but those reasons can happen anywhere else. Think about the NAFTA situation. Think about the trade wars that another country wants to start. If there was something that happened where a lot of jobs were lost in a hurry in Canada because of a trade war or a market collapse, are the systems in place in Canada able to deal with that?
Well, there we may find out in the near future, depending how the impending trade war with the U.S. Turns out in the very near future. But I suppose, regardless of whether we have the systems we want right now, regardless of whether we like the game we have right now, there's always the opportunity to prepare and shape and try to change the game for the future. And I suppose I see at this point an urgent and strong need to focus on that, as opposed to hoping that a particular leader will be able to single-handedly or even with a single government caucus override and turn the tide as to how things have been done for far too long.
Another big part of the OECD report that this is simple. The more Canadians hear about this, the more Canadians are shocked by it. And this was actually by Ed Finn in Rabble, came out on June 13th. And it talks about what the OECD found in Canada about child poverty. And it found that Canada ranked 15 out of 17 for child poverty. 21% of single Canadian mothers have to raise their children while living in poverty. It's not getting better. It's getting worse. We've had a so-called national poverty elimination program for all of this century, and it really has not made a dent whatsoever. But yet we see the top end of the societal structure having immense gains over that same point in time. We know what happens if nothing's done about child poverty. You're basically creating lifelong customers for the social services that governments claim they want to be efficient and deliver services. Well, if you keep increasing your customer base at an unreasonable rate without providing product, isn't it a snowball rolling downhill?
Certainly, that's another example of the upstream issues where if you invest reasonably now, even leaving aside the social good that comes of it, the economics make far more sense to invest than to hold off or to put the money into corporate tax cuts or whatever else the flavor of the month is to keep income flowing upward. And that's an area where within Canada, for example, there's been recent work coming out as to the distribution of child poverty. And the obvious example there is that in Quebec, child poverty is far lower, certainly not eradicated, but far lower than elsewhere in the country because of two obvious factors. The child care system, which has been in place there for decades, which has been promised to the rest of the country so many times and never delivered, and an improved child benefit to make sure that there is, in fact, enough income to avoid as many children growing up in poverty. So we know the solutions. They're being implemented in Canada as we speak, and yet somehow the rest of the country hasn't caught on and gone in the same direction.
And what can be the reason? I mean, isn't that just political choices that are made? Political choices that are avoided and consent is given for that choice? Is there no other real reason?
Certainly, I do think that's primarily a matter of politics. And there are cultural factors at play there as well. And perhaps it's the case that Quebec has had better luck preserving and building upon its social programs for being somewhat disconnected by language from the same media forces that have a stronger effect on the rest of Canada. But if so, to me, that's a reason to build connections within Canada, share the stories as to how things have worked and are working in Quebec, and hopefully get a flow of information going to make sure that what's working there can be implemented elsewhere and vice versa.
Well, I mean, to me, it just seems like a first-year economics question. I mean, if you look at Quebec, where child care is part of the system, and the rates are very reasonable, there are assistance required for anybody who cannot make them, but you know that is a very small percentage because it is such a reasonably costed system. And yet you go to places like Toronto or Vancouver or Calgary and you hear these horror stories about the exorbitant price for decent childcare, isn't that just a proof of economics that when your customer base is all the children, you can provide something at a very reasonable cost for a reasonable product? Isn't it like two sides of the same coin staring us in the face? It's like everybody says, how can we ever provide universal child care? The costs will be incredibly high. Well, not when you jump in with both feet. If you decide to actually do it, don't you think the fear-mongering about the cost of national child care is simply that? It's fear-mongering?
Oh, absolutely, especially given the research showing that in Quebec's case and projectable on a national basis, the cost of childcare is more than outweighed by, again, just the economic benefits, both in terms of the care for the children themselves, as well as the ability for more women to participate in the workforce as a result of childcare being available. But again, there are some other profit motives at play there. There are the people who are providing exorbitantly priced childcare elsewhere in the country who would potentially stand to lose out based on a system designed to make care available to everybody. So there are some forces lined up against even a strong push for childcare on a national basis. And so far, those combined with inertia have been enough to prevent much from happening yet. Now, I do believe BC is at least taking some steps toward what will be a universal system of its own, and I hope that will be a beachhead for Anglophone Canada in seeing the results of a strong childcare system and provide a model to follow.
While we're on this topic, I'm curious about what it's like in Saskatchewan, because there's such a rural population in Saskatchewan. How are issues like this handled? Is it still like the 20th century where mom stays home? Is there any sort of system out in rural Saskatchewan at all for organized childcare, or is it simply independent operators?
I'm not aware of much of a system in rural Saskatchewan, and again, the trend has been to shut down services as opposed to opening them. So bus systems, schools, hospitals, that sort of thing have been degrading over the years as opposed to being added to. There has been some effort to make schools available for community purposes, including childcare, so there may be some centers as a result of that, but that would be the rare exception, and certainly there's no strong childcare system throughout the rural areas of the province.
So again, this is basically dependent on either apathy or we've always done it this way. We're going to keep doing it this way. We don't need no damn government. And that works on a micro scale. But doesn't all the evidence show that on a macro scale, on a generational model, this is going to cost society economically and socially a lot more than paying for it up front? Isn't that what logic tells us?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, we had a big controversy in Saskatchewan over the shutdown of the Saskatchewan Transportation Company, which had been the bus service which operated in much of the province's rural areas. That was shut down last year. That was one of the few major decisions in that budget that wasn't eventually reversed despite the public pressure. And the sense is that this is just the way things are going, that whatever the benefits of providing a service across the province, especially if it were part of a broader ranging plan that incorporated the various types of services which could be integrated with each other, that it's simply seen as cheaper in the short term to abandon people, let them fend for themselves. You literally have the government out there saying that don't worry, Uber will come along and replace the rural bus system. And of course, it hasn't happened. It's not a viable model, but penny wise, pound foolish, and people will certainly be suffering for quite some time because of that lack of foresight.
I mean, these are issues that we've heard about in different parts of Canada as well. I mean, I couldn't believe that STC was shut down in Saskatchewan because I've been in Saskatchewan, and what I remember is the STC is the only scheduled transportation for people, not cargo, in a vast majority of the province. I can't imagine what it's like there for a lot of people without it. The first thing that comes to my mind is, what about people who have to get to Saskatoon or Regina for medical needs, regularly scheduled medical needs? Eliminating that bus option changes lives, but yet, you know, it's all sold as we don't need this. It's such a narrow point of view.
And certainly I expect the end result is that a number of people who would otherwise have been perfectly happy to stay in rural Saskatchewan will end up having to move because they have medical needs that necessitate having regular access to care that simply isn't available once the bus service goes away. And it was an issue for all kinds of other public services as well, in terms of libraries relying on STC to get books back and forth, in terms of the healthcare system, in terms of businesses relying on the cargo service that it did provide. And none of this seems to have been meaningfully considered ahead of time. It's simply the decision was made. We see a line item cost in the budget that we want to get rid of, and whatever that means for people, they can sort it out.
Oh boy, that sounds like a lot of fun. I mean, This is only going to contribute to problems that people insist that they're elected and going to fix. Again, we come back to the dynamic of how cutting one leg of the social program has a long-term effect on every other one. If you cut the amount in the healthcare system, it will affect education, because kids will miss school, because teachers will miss school, because this, the other thing. When you cut access to transportation, how is it going to affect education rates? How is it going to affect people graduating and what your future job force is ready to fulfill? And that could change your entire economy. It just seems to me that we need to get back to the basics and look at what we call social programs. They're called social for a reason. They're for society. And, you know, the old adage is you can tell a lot about a society by the way they treat their weakest members. How much longer can we play this game of neglect before it catches us? Or is that happening already?
I certainly think we're seeing some of the consequences of it already, but I suppose to turn back to a more hopeful note, I think that the converse is true as well, that when you make a well-planned investment in people, it can produce a positive ripple effect in terms of how easing one area of concern can allow for a person to flourish in all kinds of ways. And that if we start adopting the kind of broad-based thinking that recognizes the interconnection between social programs and the people who use them and need them and benefit from them, that there is an awful lot of room to benefit by actually being willing to innovate and step forward on those fronts, as opposed to merely fighting to preserve what we have.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But I mean, the focus, the attention, the overbearing presence of the United States on the Canadian social horizon, there are some definite lessons to be learned when we look south. there was a recent UNHCR, I can't remember. No, OHCHR. That's why, Human Rights Council. Okay. But there's a recent report that focused on the U.S., basically on poverty and human rights. And there was an absolute direct connection between those facts. The United States has the highest income inequality in the Western world. Their new tax cuts are going to do absolutely nothing to help that. The vast numbers of middle-class Americans perched on the edge. 40% of the American adult population saying they would be unable to cover an unexpected $400 expense. Now, this brings me to the point that you mentioned earlier about revenue capacity. How much longer before the average Canadian is hearing those two words every day? I think we're past that point where we should have heard them already. But considering what Doug Ford intends to do in Ontario, considering what the federal Conservatives keep singing about how taxes are too high, is there any way through the political system, the electoral system, do you see any way that any political party is going to have the balls to come out and say, look, we're simply not bringing in enough tax money. Taxes have to go up. Do you think that moment's coming in Canada?
I don't think it's that far away. And in fact, this is another area where I think there's long been a strong gap between what the public wants, at least when you ask it directly about an issue, and what politicians have actually done. And to my mind, the proposal to increase taxes on people with great amounts of income or wealth are generally fairly popular. For example, in Vancouver, where there's been this laughable attempt on the part of multimillionaire homeowners to complain about property taxes being slightly increased to a level still far below the national average, and by and large, it's getting laughed off, and the government is more popular for having included that as a way of funding some of its positive social steps. So I don't think that's an area where what's perhaps seen as conventional political wisdom actually reflects what people will approve of or even vote upon if they're given a credible option for a more progressive system. I guess taking a couple of steps back, first of all, to the issue of consumer debt and the family level fiscal picture. That's a huge issue in Canada. We have record high debt levels by our standards. We have debt levels higher than the ones that imploded the U.S. economy and financial system a decade ago. That's a serious concern that's been essentially how people have bridged the gap between stagnant wages and the desire to be seen participating in a growth economy. And I think somewhere along the line, we absolutely have to have a reckoning as to what we can do for the public to step in and take away some of the personal debt burden that renders the entire system unstable if we don't do anything about it. And I guess a further step back to where things stand in the U.S., obviously they've been through that experience and not learned a heck of a lot from it, at least based on their few recent election cycles. The signs of hope I see there is that there are a lot more young and new faces starting to get involved in politics, particularly as a response to the perception that the current president and his party are just absolute caricatures of the mustache-twirling villain. And I think there's a chance for a substantial political renaissance there. You see the Republicans fighting to essentially change the electoral rules in order to try to hang on to what they recognize as a temporary advantage. And my hope is that if they don't get there fast enough, that in fact the U.S. may not be quite the negative influence on us in the future that it has perhaps been seen to be in the recent past.
So what you're basically talking about there is the citizenry exerting some of their dormant power. And
that's right.
And that's in fact what you're saying needs to happen here as well if the Canadian public wants to see the social system improved. Because saying maintained at this point ain't that big of a deal to say when you look at the hard numbers. We need improvement. And, that goes along with what you've been saying. There's only one thing things really ever change, and that's when people demand it, correct?
That's right. And certainly it's important to keep what we have now, but it's at least as important, if not more so, to keep an eye out to how we can make things better by working together. And if we lose sight of that prospect, then certainly we're looking at stagnation at best and much worse as a very real possibility.
Now, of course, there is vast inequality. And even some of these Scandinavian countries or EU countries that, scored very well, they still have inequality. But they don't seem to have it to the degree that the North American economies have seemed to put their stamp on it. Why has this fixation with less and less revenue as economies grow and dollar numbers get bigger? How does it make any sense whatsoever when on the one hand you have politicians that trumpet how great the economy is doing? We've never seen more money flying around, but yet we're going to take even less as our population expands. Isn't this just a fundamental paradox to say those two things in the same campaign?
Well, I think there's probably a potentially valid concern that gets severely inflated as an excuse to avoid taking steps to combat inequality. There is a real concern that there is now more than ever a substantial global class of people who have simply bought their way out of society at large, that don't have any particular interest in interacting with people in their local community. They're happy moving money offshore if it'll have tax advantages. They're happy moving offshore if they see that as being to their advantage. And I can see that being something that is happening. What I can't buy is the idea that it's worth catering to that kind of person and cutting taxes in order to please that kind of person, as opposed to working on building a society where everyone has an interest in participating in your political culture. And to my mind, the inequality includes inequality in access to public spaces, access to people across class lines, and ultimately we should be looking to our tax system, to our redistribution and welfare systems as both means of providing necessary supports to people, but also means of keeping people connected, recognizing we're all in this together. Even if our cities are a little more spread out, we still share the city, share the province, share the environment, share the community, and we stay connected to each other as opposed to looking for opportunities to disconnect.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point. division only works for the guy who's holding the knife. That's usually how it goes down. Now, as far as the inequality as a concept goes, just like just about every Western country in the United States, it's always pointed to African Americans, Latino Americans seem to bear an overwhelming percentage of this neglect and inequality. Canada is no different, is it? In fact, it's quite historical in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
And we know what group that
certainly, is. Absolutely. For Indigenous people, and they're the primary example of Canada's failure to live up to our self-image, even in the past, as much as things may have gotten worse in some areas recently. And of course, the backdrop there is the explicit policy of genocide in far too many places, far too many times up into the recent past. And to my mind, if you're going to portray yourself to yourself and to the world as a generous, compassionate country, step one should probably be to recognize the things you've done wrong, the people that you've treated badly, and start making amends as opposed to trying to preserve historical inequities as long as you can get away with it. And unfortunately, our reaction to the continued gap in treatment between Indigenous people and the rest of the people in Canada has largely been to delay as long as we can and act only when we're ordered to.
Well, I think that's a very good point because, we've been trying to talk about, okay, what happens in the future when you ignore this stuff today or in the last 10 years. And you look at the situation of Indigenous people and Canada, quote unquote, look what we've been dealing with the last 5 years. Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the residential school inquiry, the 60s scoop. Now those decisions are coming full circle on us today. So, this is what really I think people need to consider with the low levels of social support and the inflated cost of education and the stagnant wages. The ability, I think people have to understand the ability of the average person going forward, their mean lifetime income is no longer going up. People need to understand this. So, how much of what the Indigenous neglect over generations that is now being put on the national stage, how much of that is a harbinger for what may happen in the future? And it might be a lot sooner than the 30, 40 years those issues took.
Well, again, to me, it's an indication that in the past we certainly haven't lived up to the image we have of ourselves. And the examples I'd point out for the moment are, first of all, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal decision, which finally formally recognized the discrimination in the availability of child and family services for people living on First Nations as opposed to people elsewhere. And even after that decision was made and the government was ordered to rectify it, the answer was 2 years of foot dragging, saying that it had to fit into the government's existing budget cycle, and essentially putting things off as long as they could be until finally that aspect of the gap in treatment became more than the government was willing to continue to defend. But there are still gigantic gaps in terms of education funding, health service availability, housing, food, clean water, and all the basics of life essentially are more expensive to the extent they're available at all for the people who, again, are already facing a gross historical disadvantage as a result of how they've been treated by Canadian governments. And to me, step one in terms of exercising compassion and generosity has to be to identify those past wrongs and put a concerted effort into righting them. And it just isn't happening at the governmental level at the moment.
I mean, anybody who looks into it with any seriousness can obviously find the generational neglect and flat-out abuse of Indigenous people in Canada. I mean, what Dr. Blackstock has done with her never-ending tenacity to get this addressed, and rightly so. I mean, there have been, every decision that's come down has been against the government of Canada, but yet they just don't get around to getting anything done. Imagine if that was to happen in a different segment of society. I don't think we'd see the same response. So again, there's no other word that fits. Well, there are two words that fit. One I can say on the air, and that's politics.
Mm-hmm.
It's basically politics. But this pass the buck attitude, this only works for so long before you hit a brick wall. We've seen it in other entire economies. Never mind one sector or one part of government policy that we're heading towards here. What do you do when you have different levels of government that do nothing but keep pointing the finger and saying it's their fault, not me? And then you get the same thing back and forth. I mean, we were talking about it before we went on air. Premier of Saskatchewan, not his party, not his comms department, the Premier himself basically plagiarized a graphic about numbers to make it about something totally unrelated. What do you have to say about politics done at this level? Not only one, does it ignore the reality of the data, but it presents the data to attack a third party that has got nothing to do with it. Like, how can this go on and we expect reasonable discourse in the future of our social systems?
Yeah, and that's an example, that being Premier Scott Moe trying to use data from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives to essentially attack Quebec's childcare system. To me, that's a prime example of wrongly attacking not just a third party, but the very idea of necessary social programs, the idea that the fact that Quebec does have a well-funded and effective childcare program is somehow a reason to refuse them federal equalization money. The fact that they've chosen to raise the necessary revenue within their province to take care of people is somehow a mark against them when it comes to allocating equalization. So it's not just a matter of the accuracy involved, it's also a matter of the fundamental values involved. And to me, the more important point on which to push back is the fact that the point on which he's criticizing them, Quebec has it right. That's a model we should be seeking to emulate. And if equalization is part of what allows that to happen, along with the choices they made about revenue, then that's a strong check in favor of the equalization system as it stands.
Well, I think it's rather ironic. I mean, when you take a look at the actual numbers in the study that Premier Moe tried to use to attack Quebec, when you look at the actual report and the data, it turns out the joke's on him. I mean, if you look at the provincial tax burden on businesses, the overall tax burden on businesses in provinces, Quebec is number one, but it's still just under 3%. Saskatchewan, dead last, 1.4. So, I mean, this is the thing that blows my mind. Some of these politicians try misinformation, but if people actually have the intent or the desire to follow it through, that's the dumbest thing in the world they can pick. you're attacking number 1 from number 10. I just don't understand the methodology that passes off and goes uncountered.
Well, part of the issue there is, I think, what people, again, take to be the default political assumptions. And we've been conditioned at this point to assume that what's good for business, however it's defined at any moment, is what you have to pursue, whether it's a matter of ideology or pragmatism or whatever other excuses being trotted out. And so I'm sure there would be people who look at a variation of 1.5% in the total amount of taxes paid by business and say that they'd reverse the analysis of who's doing well, who's doing poorly, and say that you should be looking to drive that as low as possible and again, never mind the impact on the lives of actual people. And I do think that's an area where there's only so much we can do to change the minds of the general public. I think more people are probably on side than the political class would assume, but it's necessary to shift what's seen as politically acceptable in order to say that, yes, in fact, there's both demand and valid reasons for ensuring that the people who have more end up paying more, and that the result of that will be programs that are both extremely popular and extremely beneficial for everyone, including the people who end up paying slightly more in the short term.
I would agree with that. 100%. Now, the other thing that I wanted to mention is we'll go back to revenue capacity. I mean, everybody by now should understand the effect of Prime Minister Harper's populist reduction of the GST, which immediately wiped out the surplus he was given and put him on the path to 8 straight deficits. But it was done for political reasons. It sure as hell didn't make any sense. There have been studies out that said if Alberta, the only province or territory without a PST or an HST, a 5% provincial tax in Alberta would eliminate a deficit which is over $8 billion for slightly more than 4 million residents. But there's no political will. What can happen to change the political will? Is it only public participation?
In various forms, I would think so. It means not just getting out and voting, but probably trying to change the composition of the people who are actually pursuing and winning a place in office as well. Although I guess that makes Alberta an especially interesting example, since it was lucky enough to see an unexpected change in government last time out, a government that has been willing to seek out new revenue in some cases, challenge some of the conventional wisdom around carbon taxes and climate change. Unfortunately, it hasn't gone that step further in terms of bringing Alberta up to the standard of the rest of the country in terms of consumption taxes. And my guess is that you're likely a term or two away from either the fiscal situation being perceived as dangerous enough that multiple parties agree on a PST, or a midterm or end of term type of decision that a party is willing to take the political risk to apply a PST, particularly if that's seen as necessary in order to even meet the standard of enough election promises to have something to appeal to voters. But certainly at this point, I don't see any reasonable prospect of Jason Kenney and his party taking a rational position on a PST, so any attempt to apply one will be fought tooth and nail every step of the way. And yes, there may have been an opportunity missed over the first couple of years, especially of Rachel Notley's term, to at least start that conversation, if not to make the final decision and perhaps lay the groundwork for a future government to take what seems to be an obviously necessary step.
I mean, I've seen different studies that say Alberta could basically double their taxation, and they would still be the overall lowest tax burden in Canada. I mean, the amount under the average that Alberta is so vast, but yet we have populist politicians in Alberta screaming about how the NDP has ruined the economy with their taxation. It just simply doesn't exist.
Well, nor does that view of the economy have any basis in fact. But
well, exactly. But I wanted to ask you, what picture does 21st century media play in the urgency and the reality of the social support system in Canada? Couldn't they be doing a lot more to demonstrate reality instead of filming press releases from government?
In theory, yes, but there are a few different connected vicious cycles that have made that difficult, both in terms of the cuts that have been made to the capacity for investigative journalism, the capability of actually producing new content as opposed to simply reproducing press releases, combined with the and it's certainly not a bad thing in all ways, but the spread of so many more different news outlets being available, which mean that even if there is good reporting going on in one outlet, if it's not being covered elsewhere, or if enough people are dependent on an outlet that chooses, in some cases for political reasons, not to make any mention of important stories, which would perhaps change how people view the world, then even that good work perhaps may not have the effect that it should. Now, it's certainly not as bad in Canada as it is in the U.S. with the absolute anti-reality bubble created around Fox News and the Republican Party apparatus. But at the same time, we also have some channels that people are using to get the news they want, as opposed to the news that perhaps would do the most to influence the choices they'd make. And that's a big question, and one for which I won't claim to have anything approaching a meaningful answer. It's a combination of systemic factors and individual choices, and where to start is an open question.
I know. I mean, I just get frustrated. I mean, one other thing I want to throw out for your opinion that I haven't brought up to you yet. What is the connection with law enforcement, with the courts, with the lack of legal aid in this big picture of the social welfare of society going forward? We've seen drastic cuts to legal aid. The courts are overfilling. Law enforcement never has a problem getting their budgets approved, no matter what it is. But aren't they just perpetuating these cycles that we're getting into, that disadvantaged people are so much more likely to commit crimes, so much more likely to be incarcerated? All the lines we hear, isn't it a chain reaction? Isn't this the snowball running down the hill thing? Do we need a change in law enforcement and the courts to facilitate a societal improvement?
At this point, I'm more concerned with the federal policy around criminal justice than some of those other aspects of the system. In particular, knowing what the Harper government did to try to make crime into a perpetual political wedge issue, trying to say that everything would be fixed if only we had stricter sentences or less availability of bail or that sort of thing. And it was apparently a political winner for them for some time, and we haven't seen what I would have hoped in terms of reversal of some of those policies since the Liberals took power. Certainly, there are big issues with the availability of legal aid, of the counsel necessary for people to defend their rights, especially in the face of a system that's designed to be less flexible and less responsive to the circumstances of any particular individual. I will mention, however, what I think is a good news story as to the difference between the political view of police operations and perhaps the police themselves. Right now in Regina, there is a protest going on in which a number of teepees have been set up by Indigenous activists. In Wascana Park, our big urban park, shortly in advance of the Canada Day celebrations planned for next week. And the park authority has called in the police several times. The police have unfortunately cleared out the protests several times. Most recently, however, the protests have grown, the number of people active has grown, and in the last day or so, while the park authority is calling for the people to be cleared out again, the police are saying no. That is a matter of community relations, is a matter of community safety, is a matter of what's best for the community. They are allowing the activists to stay on the site and to continue making their point as opposed to being cleared away. Now, I'm not sure how long that will last, and I'm sure that the pressure will build with time, but that to me is an instance where you still have people involved in these institutions who recognize the importance to their community of treating the people involved as humans worth respecting, as opposed to problems to be whisked away into a cell somewhere and never heard from again. And my hope is that we can recognize those kinds of examples and hopefully see more of our justice system directed toward that type of mutual respect, as opposed to the lock 'em up principle that plays well politically but does nothing but harm to the people affected by it.
Well, I think we may be hitting some sort of a reckoning point with that concept in general as we look forward to what may be happening in the lower mainland of British Columbia with Kinder Morgan. We've already seen, as usual, huge protests in Montreal against that pipeline being nationalized. So maybe Regina police are getting ahead of the ball a bit here, but was there not also a teepee put up in front of the Regina legislature that has been removed?
That's right. That's the same location. The legislature is located on the edge of Wascana Park. Yeah. And yeah, certainly the issue of pipeline protesters is going to be a very important one, but there too, I'm not sure that the problem is so much the police decision makers as the economic decision makers. I'm trying to recall who it was, but I know it was one prominent person being asked to comment on pipeline issues who talked about it being both inevitable and acceptable that lives would be lost as people try to protect their land and their water, and the fact that there are actually people making the case that wringing a few extra dollars of profit out of the tar sands is somehow worth sacrificing people's lives. Just shows how, for at least some people, the priorities are completely out of whack.
Yes, that was former Governor of the Bank of Canada, David Dodge, addressing the Edmonton Chamber of Commerce. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, it's a good thing that Mr. Dodge is no longer on the public payroll making statements like that. I guess you can do that when you're an old rich white guy. But regardless, yeah, it was rather inflammatory, and I think you're correct. It does give a demonstration of what the other side discusses over cocktails, which is unfortunate. While we're on the subject, I know this late August, Regina will have probably more international media in town than they've had in quite some time as the Canadian Women's Open Golf Tournament comes. Do you see an appetite that these protests will still be ongoing then?
I'm curious to see at this point. Probably the next big test is going to be once Canada Day has come and gone, whether the protests continue after that point or whether that's seen as a safe time to attempt to clear them out again. But certainly my hope is that there will still be, whether in that form or in another form, an effort to get the message out when there's more attention focused on Regina, and hopefully reach a few people who wouldn't otherwise understand the issues that people are facing here right now.
Well, that tournament will be played at Wascana Country Club, so it's not all that far away. So it will be interesting because it would make my time in Regina in August more enjoyable if such an event was transpiring at the same time. So I guess we'll see what happens. Is there anything we haven't covered tonight that you want to bring up?
I don't think so. It's good to always take the time to chat about how we should be looking to improve ourselves. And I think we've had a chance to go over a few of those tonight. So once again, thanks for the invitation, and glad to have the chance to discuss.
Well, I knew you were the right guy for this topic, Greg, and I'm just worried about this never-ending, like I called it, a fetish to lower taxes. When will people realize that there is no free lunch? This just cannot go on, especially when such a small amount of the population is making such rapid and large gains in their income and their worth, and they're doing nothing to help everybody else. That's just not the way the middle class was built. You know, I look back from time to time on statements by President Dwight Eisenhower, a Republican, a military man. And when he was president and the middle class birth expansion was happening in the 50s, the top tax rate was 83% in the United States. And that seemed like quite a profitable society to me. But yet, none of that seems to matter today. I just hope that we can turn the corner before it's too late.
Well, likewise, and part of the problem too is at the same time we have to be skeptical of what's being sold on the political scene. We also have to recognize the importance of ultimately being able to trust an institution in being able to care for and provide for people. That's another side to this, is that I think people have been prepared to accept very small gains in terms of tax cuts or other shiny baubles, as opposed to demanding more based on the question of whether governments will in fact deliver. And I do think part of the necessary change in values and attitudes has to involve emphasizing that it is in fact possible to do better, and making the commitment to offer that.
Do you see the attitude from the millennials, from the Gen Y, from past millennials, voters in the next decade? Do you see a different attitude in them? Do they see things clearer than what is presented to them? Let's put it that way.
I'm not sure I see a huge difference as compared to similarly aged people in previous generations. I do think there are some challenges in terms of getting the millennial generation to see politics as the way of bringing about change. But to the extent it's possible to do that, I do think there's a great opportunity to find the answers to the the questions that I think younger people tend to rightly have about their future and what we're doing to care for them and for the people they care about.
Well, that's a whole other issue we didn't even get into, the amount of younger people now that are removed from the workforce to care for their elders. That's a whole other issue. Mm-hmm. I'm sure we could talk about that in the future. But we think we're generous, but I think we need to re-examine that and take a look at some hard numbers and make the decision on what the public good is. I hope that can happen. And I thank you for your input on this issue. But I think you will agree when I say Canada, we're not as sharing as we think. Isn't that the simple way to put it?
Exactly. And how we see ourselves is how we ought to be, but we have a heck of a lot of work to do to actually get there.
All righty, Greg Fingers, thank you very much for your time tonight.
All right, thanks again. And yes, always great to participate.
Thank you, sir. Good night.
Good night.
All righty, that was Greg Fingers. Like I said, Canada is generous, isn't it? Not according to the numbers. Thank you, everybody, for listening tonight. We'll see you next week on The View Up Here.